The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Copper Creek as Silas Ward pushed through the batwing doors of Jeremiah's general store. At 45, he commanded attention wherever he went, 6 feet of weathered muscle and bone steel gray eyes that had stared down rustlers and rival ranchers alike, and the confident stride of a man who had carved his empire from the unforgiving desert through sheer force of will. His spurs clinked against the wooden planks with each step, announcing his presence like a declaration of authority. The afternoon crowd parted naturally before him. Farmers counting precious coins for seed nodded respectfully. Ranch wives selecting fabric for their families' clothes stepped aside with practiced deference. Children pressed against candy jars fell silent as he passed, instinctively recognizing power when they saw it. This was Silas Ward's world, a place where his word carried weight, where his approval could make or break a man's prospects, where 30 years of back-breaking labor had earned him something more valuable than money respect. Then she walked in, and everything changed. The doors swung open with unusual force, and she filled the frame like a living shadow cast by some impossibly tall giant. Nearly 6.5 feet of lean strength, she moved with the fluid grace of a predator, each step deliberate and controlled. Her long obsidian hair fell in a single thick braid down her back, adorned with small silver ornaments that caught the light and threw it back in tiny dancing sparks. She wore simple clothes, a blue cotton dress that had obviously been tailored for her extraordinary height, practical leather boots that had seen countless miles of desert terrain. But there was something in her bearing that transformed the mundane into the magnificent. The entire store fell silent. It wasn't just her height that commanded attention, though. That alone would have been remarkable in any gathering. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet dignity that seemed to emanate from her very bones. Her dark eyes swept the store's contents with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to making life or death assessments. But there was no aggression in her gaze, only careful intelligence. Silas watched from behind a display of harnesses as she approached Jeremiah's counter. The store owner, normally a fountain of endless chatter about weather and politics, and the latest gossip from distant settlements, seemed struck mute by her presence. She placed precise silver coins on the worn wooden surface, more money than most customers spent in a single visit, and pointed to her selections with elegant efficiency. Flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, sugar, ammunition. Basic supplies, but purchased in quantities that suggested preparation for a long journey or an extended stay. Nothing unusual in the items themselves, but Jeremiah handled each transaction with an almost ceremonial reverence that struck Silas as completely out of character. Even more puzzling was the reaction of the other customers. Old Murphy, who had never shown deference to anyone in his 78 years of stubborn independence, actually removed his battered hat as she passed near him. The Henderson sisters, notorious gossips who usually dissected every newcomer with surgical precision, watched her with something approaching awe. Little Tommy Baker, the most mischievous boy in 3 counties, and the terror of every shopkeeper, stood perfectly still as she walked by, his usual fidgeting replaced by an almost reverential quiet. These weren't the reactions of people seeing a mere curiosity or oddity. This was respect, the kind of deep, instinctive recognition that couldn't be demanded or purchased, only earned through actions and character that spoke louder than words. Silas should have recognized these signs for what they were, warnings that this was no ordinary traveler seeking supplies for an ordinary journey. But his mind was occupied with his own concerns, the fence posts that needed replacing before the autumn storms, the cattle prices that seemed to shift with every rumor from back east, the eternal challenge of maintaining his position as the territory's most successful rancher. In his world, respect flowed toward land ownership and livestock wealth, not toward whatever mysterious quality this unusual woman possessed. When she completed her substantial purchases and turned toward the door, her path brought her directly past where Silas stood, examining saddle leather. She paused, her impressive height casting a shadow across his workspace, and tilted her head in a gesture that managed to be both polite and somehow regal. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the soft, measured cadence of someone for whom English was a carefully mastered second language. "I'm looking for work. Someone in town mentioned that you might need help at your ranch." Her gaze met his directly, no submission, no pleading, no hint of desperation that might have explained why someone would seek employment from a stranger. Just a straightforward request from one adult to another, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. The conversations around them had died away completely. Every person in the store was now listening, waiting to see how the territory's most prominent rancher would respond to this unprecedented request. Silas felt their attention like physical pressure against his chest, and his pride responded by swelling to fill the space their expectations had created. He looked her up and down with deliberate slowness, taking in her extraordinary height and the bronze cast of her skin that marked her heritage, the way she stood without fidgeting or showing any sign of discomfort under his scrutiny. In that moment, he should have seen her obvious intelligence, her dignified bearing, the respect she commanded from everyone around her. Instead, all he could focus on was how different she was from his usual workers, how her presence might affect his carefully cultivated reputation. "You're too tall for me," he declared, his voice pitched to carry clearly through the suddenly silent store. "I need workers who can fit through doorways without having to duck, who won't spook my horses just by standing up straight. Hell, you'd probably get your head caught in the barn rafters and bring the whole damn roof down." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but the laughter died quickly when people saw the woman's reaction, or rather, her complete lack of one. Her expression didn't change by even the slightest degree. No flash of anger, no wounded flinch, no defensive retort that might have escalated the confrontation. She simply absorbed his words with the same calm attention she had given to selecting her supplies, as if she had expected nothing better, and was neither surprised nor particularly disappointed by his response. She nodded once, a gesture so controlled and dignified it seemed almost royal, then turned toward the door. But as she moved through the store, something extraordinary happened that should have warned Silas of the magnitude of his mistake. Every person she passed stepped back respectfully, creating a clear path as if she were visiting royalty, rather than a job seeker who had just been publicly humiliated. Jeremiah actually bowed his head as she approached his counter to collect her purchases. Mrs. Patterson, the town's most formidable matron and harshest critic of anyone who didn't meet her exacting standards, placed her hand over her heart in a gesture that seemed almost like a blessing. Even the children watched her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for Sunday service or Independence Day celebrations. At the doorway, she paused and looked back. Her eyes found Silas across the crowded store, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. They regarded each other in complete silence. There was no hatred in her gaze, no promise of revenge or retribution. Just a profound sadness that made something deep in Silas's chest tighten with unexpected and unwelcome discomfort. Then she was gone, disappearing into the harsh afternoon light, like a vision that might have been imagined if not for the lingering scent of sage and leather that marked her passage. The store remained unnaturally quiet for several heartbeats before conversations gradually resumed. But Silas noticed that no one would meet his eyes. Even Jeremiah seemed to find his inventory fascinating as he rang up Silas's purchases with unusual haste, his normally friendly chatter replaced by terse professional efficiency. "Busy day," Silas commented, trying to recapture the comfortable atmosphere that had always surrounded his visits to the store. "Yes, sir," Jeremiah replied without looking up from his ledger. "Very busy indeed." That was quite a sight, wasn't it, woman that tall asking for ranch work? What do you suppose she was thinking? Jeremiah's hands stilled on his pencil for just a moment, then resumed their calculations with increased focus. "I couldn't say, Mr. Ward. Couldn't say at all." Silas completed his business and loaded his supplies into his wagon, feeling oddly unsettled despite his satisfaction at having handled the situation decisively. A man in his position couldn't afford to show weakness or uncertainty, especially not in front of half the town. He had made his standards clear: his ranch, his rules, his judgment about who was suitable for employment. The ride back to his property took him through the familiar landscape that had become the foundation of his identity: rolling grassland dotted with hardy mesquite trees, his prize cattle scattered across pastures that stretched to the distant mountains, the weathered but well-maintained buildings that represented decades of backbreaking work and careful investment. This was his kingdom, built through determination and defended through strength. No one, regardless of their size, background, or the mysterious respect they commanded from townspeople, had the right to make him feel uncertain about his choices. But as the sun began its descent toward the distant peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that usually filled him with satisfaction, Silas heard something that made his confident mood falter like a candle flame in an unexpected wind. Drums. At first the sound was so faint, he thought it might be his imagination, a rhythmic beating that seemed to echo from the hills beyond his property line, carried on the desert wind like distant thunder. But as he guided his horses into the ranch yard and began unloading his supplies, the drumming grew clearer, more insistent, more obviously deliberate. This wasn't the random noise of some distant celebration or casual gathering. The rhythm was too controlled, too purposeful, carrying a message he couldn't understand, but somehow felt resonating in his bones like an ancient warning passed down through generations of desert survivors. His horses shifted nervously in their traces, ears twitching toward the sound, with the alertness of prey animals sensing danger. His cattle, normally content to graze peacefully in the evening light, had gathered in tight clusters at the far end of the pasture, their heads raised and alert, as if detecting threats beyond human perception. Silas tried to dismiss his growing unease as he completed his evening chores with hands that weren't quite as steady as usual. Apache ceremonies were common enough in this territory, and there was no logical reason to assume they had anything to do with him personally. The treaties signed years ago had brought peace to the region, creating prosperity for both sides through trade agreements and mutual respect for territorial boundaries. Whatever was happening in those distant hills was undoubtedly none of his concern. But the drumming continued through the night, sometimes loud enough to rattle his windows and make his coffee cup dance on the kitchen table, sometimes so soft it seemed like whispers in his restless dreams. And with each rhythmic beat, his animals grew more agitated, huddling together and making the low, anxious sounds that usually preceded storms or other natural disasters. When dawn finally broke over the eastern ridges, the drumming stopped, abruptly replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums like deep water. Silas stepped onto his porch with his morning coffee, grateful for the return to normalcy, and surveyed his domain with what he tried to convince himself was the usual satisfaction of a successful man reviewing his accomplishments. Then he saw them. At first, they were just dark shapes on the ridge that overlooked his ranch, perhaps a dozen figures on horseback, silhouetted against the brightening sky like statues carved from shadow and determination. Silas squinted against the morning glare, trying to make out details across the considerable distance. Cowboys from neighboring ranches, perhaps, or travelers who had taken shelter for the night on high ground. But as his eyes adjusted and the growing light revealed more details, he realized these weren't casual visitors or fellow ranchers checking their boundaries. They sat their horses with military precision, spaced at perfectly regular intervals along the entire visible length of the ridge. And they were all facing his ranch, watching with the patient stillness of predators studying their prey before deciding whether to strike. A cold knot formed in Silas's stomach as he began to count them, his coffee growing cold in his forgotten grip. 20, 30, perhaps more. It was difficult to determine exact numbers at this distance, but their positions seemed to stretch as far as his vision could reach along the ridgeline. These weren't cowboys or travelers. The formal spacing, the deliberate positioning, and the obvious coordination spoke of military organization and serious purpose. These were Apache warriors, and they had positioned themselves to observe his every movement. Silas tried desperately to convince himself that this was merely coincidence, that perhaps they were conducting some kind of ceremony or hunting expedition that had nothing whatsoever to do with him or his ranch. But as the morning progressed and the figures remained motionless on the ridge, He couldn't shake the memory of yesterday's encounter, the tall woman's dignified request for work, his public dismissal delivered with calculated cruelty, the strange reverence she had commanded from everyone in the store. By midday, his nervousness had transformed into genuine alarm. More riders had appeared on different ridges surrounding his property, arriving from hidden trails he hadn't even known existed, emerging from landscapes he had thought empty and uninhabited. Each group took position with the same military precision, creating an ever-tightening circle of watchers around his ranch that spoke of careful planning and serious intent. This wasn't a casual gathering or coincidental convergence. This was a deliberate, coordinated positioning of forces that required advanced planning, detailed knowledge of the terrain, and the kind of organization that only came from unified command and shared purpose. Silas had heard stories of Apache war parties, though such conflicts had been rare in recent years, as treaties and trade agreements had maintained an uneasy but profitable peace. There was no logical reason for hostility, no recent incidents or disputes that might have triggered this kind of response, unless the memory of the woman's dignified departure played through his mind again, accompanied by the puzzling respect she had commanded from his neighbors. What if his casual cruelty had been more significant than he realized? What if she had been someone important, someone whose public humiliation could not be overlooked or dismissed as merely the rudeness of one ignorant settler? As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, casting the surrounding hills in deeper relief that made the watching figures even more ominous, Silas made a decision that felt both necessary and potentially suicidal. He saddled his fastest horse, checked his rifle to ensure it was loaded and ready, and rode toward the nearest ridge to confront the watchers directly. If they wanted something from him, he would face them head-on rather than cower in his ranch house like a frightened animal waiting for the inevitable. 30 years of frontier life had taught him that uncertainty was often worse than danger, and that problems rarely resolved themselves without direct action. But when he reached the base of the slope and began climbing toward the watching figures, one of the warriors, a man wearing an elaborate feathered headdress that marked him as a leader, raised his hand in a clear, unmistakable signal to stop. Even from a distance of several hundred yards, the message was perfectly clear: approach no further. The warrior called out something in Apache, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air despite the distance. Though Silas couldn't understand the words, the tone was unmistakable. It was a question, and somehow he knew with absolute certainty that it concerned the woman from the store. Silas called back in English, his voice cracking slightly, despite his efforts to sound confident and in control. "What do you want? I haven't done anything wrong. This is my land, and you have no right to threaten me." His words seemed to hang in the desert air for a moment before an exchange in Apache rippled along the ridge as his response was relayed between the warriors. Then the leader spoke again, and this time Silas caught familiar sounds mixed with the unfamiliar language words that sounded like tall woman and insult, and what might have been his own name, spoken with what could only be described as contempt. The realization hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making his hands shake on the reins. They knew. They knew exactly what he had done. In the general store, knew about his casual cruelty and public humiliation of the woman who had asked him for honest work. And they were here because of it. As Silas rode back to his ranch house, his mind raced through possibilities like a trapped animal seeking escape. Maybe he could explain that it had been a misunderstanding, that he hadn't meant any serious offense to anyone important. Maybe he could offer some kind of compensation money, cattle supplies, whatever it might take to resolve this situation without violence. There had to be some way to make this right, some path back to the peaceful coexistence that had defined this territory for years. But as evening approached and the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, his options seemed to narrow with each passing minute. More fires appeared on the surrounding ridges, not war fires or signals of immediate attack, but controlled ceremonial flames that created a ring of flickering lights around his property, like stars brought down to earth. The message was unmistakably clear. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and completely at their mercy. Silas spent the night pacing his ranch house like a caged wolf rifle in hand, starting at every sound that penetrated the desert silence. The wind through the cottonwood trees became footsteps. A coyote's distant call transformed into war cries. The nervous lowing of his cattle sounded like the voices of ghosts seeking vengeance for wrongs that could never be undone. When he did manage to doze fitfully in his chair, exhaustion overcoming anxiety, for brief moments he dreamed of the tall woman's calm face and the inexplicable respect she had commanded from everyone who saw her. By dawn he looked haggard and defeated, a man who had finally begun to understand that actions carried consequences and that some mistakes were too significant to be dismissed or ignored. As the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that should have been beautiful, but now seemed ominous, a single rider began descending from the main ridge toward his ranch house. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, carrying what appeared to be a white cloth tied to a long staff, the universal symbol of truce that offered hope for negotiation rather than immediate violence. Silas stepped onto his porch rifle lowered, but ready as the rider approached through the morning light. As the figure drew closer, he could see it was an elderly Apache man, his weathered face marked with the dignified lines of someone who had witnessed the passage of many seasons. His clothing was formal traditional leather, decorated with intricate beadwork and feathers that spoke of high status within his community. Despite his obvious age, he sat his horse with the straight-backed posture of a lifelong warrior who had never learned to show weakness. The old man dismounted with careful precision, his movements respectful but completely unafraid, and approached to within comfortable speaking distance. "You are Silas Ward," he said in clear, educated English that carried only the slightest trace of accent. It wasn't a question, but a statement of established fact. "I am." Silas replied, his voice hoarse from a sleepless night spent contemplating his mortality. "What do you want?" The elderly man studied him with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. The fear poorly hidden behind false bravado, the rifle held with hands that trembled slightly, despite obvious efforts at control. The stubborn pride that even now refused to fully acknowledge the gravity of the situation he had created. "Yesterday you spoke words to someone," the old man said carefully, choosing each word with the precision of someone navigating dangerous territory. "You told her she was too tall for your work." Silas's mouth went dry as desert sand. So you do not know who she was?" The words hung between them, like a blade waiting to fall. Silas wanted to ask why it mattered, wanted to protest that he couldn't be expected to know the personal history of every stranger who walked into the general store. But something in the old man's eyes warned him that such responses would only make his situation worse. "Should I?" he asked instead. The old man was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal to someone who had already proven himself capable of such thoughtless cruelty. "She is Ayana," he said finally. "In your language, this means eternal blossom. She is the daughter of Chief Running Bear leader of the mountain Apache, whose territory extends from the Red Rocks to the Great River. She is also promised in marriage to the son of Chief Ironhawk, whose people control the lands beyond the eastern mountains." The implications crashed over Silas like an avalanche of ice and stone. A chief's daughter, someone promised in marriage to unite two powerful tribes in an alliance that would affect the balance of power across hundreds of miles of territory. And he had humiliated her publicly in front of witnesses, treating her like a common drifter seeking charity work from his superior position. "I didn't know." Silas stammered the words, sounding pathetically inadequate, even to his own ears. "No." The old man agreed with devastating gentleness. "You did not know. But ignorance does not erase insult, just as darkness does not erase the stars. She came to your town in peace, seeking honest work to occupy her time before the marriage ceremony that will bind our peoples together. You chose to make her feel small in front of your people. In doing so, you made both our peoples feel small as well. The elderly Apache gestured toward the surrounding ridges, where hundreds of warriors waited in the morning light, like a vast constellation of potential violence, their presence transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. Chief Running Bear has called for justice to restore his daughter's honor. Chief Ironhawk has answered with his own warriors to demonstrate that insults to his future daughter-in-law will not be ignored. Both tribes now ask the same question. What kind of man speaks so cruelly to a woman who has done nothing wrong? What kind of people allow such disrespect to go unanswered? Silas looked around at the assembled forces, hundreds upon hundreds of warriors from 2 different tribes, all here because of his moment of casual cruelty. The scope of his mistake was staggering, like discovering that stepping on what he thought was a small stone had actually triggered an avalanche that now threatened to bury everything he had built. "What do you want from me?" he asked quietly, his voice barely carrying across the small distance between them. Before the old man could answer, movement on the eastern ridge drew their attention like iron filings to a magnet. A new group of riders was descending toward the ranch, their horses moving with the disciplined precision of a military formation. Unlike the others, these warriors wore different ceremonial paint, red and black, instead of blue and white, and their weapons gleamed with the careful maintenance of a professional fighting force that had seen real combat. "Chief Ironhawk comes now," the old man said with solemn gravity. "He wishes to see the man who insulted his future daughter-in-law with his own eyes." Silas felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Chief Ironhawk's reputation was legendary throughout the territory, and beyond a warrior who had never lost a battle, a negotiator who had prevented countless conflicts through a deadly combination of wisdom and barely contained violence. He was said to be a man who could see into a person's heart with a single glance and judge their true character with the accuracy of a rifle shot. The approaching riders reached the ranch yard in perfect formation, and their leader dismounted with fluid grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. Chief Ironhawk was younger than Silas had expected, perhaps 40 years old, but his presence filled the space around him like heat from a forge, commanding attention and respect through sheer force of personality. His intelligent eyes swept over the scene with the methodical precision of a general surveying a battlefield, cataloging every detail from Silas's trembling hands to the defensive way he held his rifle, to the signs of sleepless fear written in the lines of his face. When Ironhawk spoke, his English was not just fluent, but refined, carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to choosing words with the same care a craftsman might select tools for delicate work. "Mr. Ward," he said, his voice carrying no anger, but somehow more threatening for its calm control. "I understand you have strong opinions about the appropriate height for Apache women." Silas's throat felt like he had been swallowing sand for hours. "Chief Ironhawk, I made a terrible mistake. I didn't know who she was, didn't understand." "Ah," Ironhawk interrupted with a slight nod. "You think knowing her identity would have changed your words?" The question was clearly a trap, and Silas recognized it immediately, despite his fear-clouded thinking. Saying yes would mean he only showed respect to important people, that his courtesy was conditional on status rather than basic human decency. Saying no would mean he stood by his insult, that he found nothing wrong with his behavior regardless of its target. "I should have been respectful to anyone seeking honest work," Silas managed finally. "A person's worth isn't determined by who their father is or what tribe they belong to." "Better," Ironhawk acknowledged, with the faintest hint of approval. "But words are wind that blows away with the next storm. What matters is understanding, and understanding can only be proven through action." He gestured to his warriors, then to the hills where Running Bear's tribe waited with patient menace that seemed to charge the very air with electricity. "Do you see what your careless words have cost 2 powerful tribes forced to abandon their normal activities, hunting, trading, preparing for winter, celebrating marriages, and mourning deaths, all to address your casual cruelty. Treaties strained, peace threatened, alliances questioned, all because you could not keep your ignorant thoughts to yourself when faced with someone different from your narrow expectations. Silas looked around at the hundreds of assembled warriors, finally beginning to comprehend the full scope of what his moment of pride had unleashed. It wasn't just about one insult to one person. It was about honor, respect, and the delicate balance that kept peace in this dangerous territory, where different peoples had learned to coexist through mutual understanding and carefully maintain dignity. "I see it," he said quietly. "I understand what I've done." "Good. Now you must choose how to address it." Ironhawk stepped closer, close enough that Silas could see the controlled fury burning behind his calm exterior, like molten metal contained within steel walls. "We could handle this the old way. Blood for insult, violence for violence. Your ranch burned to ash, your cattle scattered to the four winds, your bones left for the vultures, as a warning to others who might think Apache women exist for their amusement or judgment." Silas's grip tightened on his rifle, though he knew it would be utterly useless against so many skilled warriors. "Or," Ironhawk continued his voice, taking on a different quality that somehow managed to be both more hopeful and more terrifying, "we can try something different. Something Ayanna herself suggested when she learned what was being planned in response to your insult." "What did she suggest?" "She said you might be capable of learning, that perhaps your cruelty came from ignorance rather than evil, and that ignorance can sometimes be cured through proper education." Ironhawk's eyes held a challenge that seemed to look straight through to Silas's soul, weighing and measuring what he found there. She proposed a test. "You will work for her people for 30 days. No pay, no special treatment, no consideration for your feelings or your pride or your position in the community. You will do whatever task you are given, no matter how humble, no matter how difficult, no matter how it might damage your reputation among your own people. If you complete this period with dignity and genuine effort, the insult will be forgiven and the matter closed. If you refuse, or if you fail to meet the standards expected," he didn't need to finish the sentence. The assembled warriors made the consequences abundantly clear. "And if I agree to this, then we learn whether you are truly sorry for your actions or merely afraid of their consequences. We discover if you have the strength to grow beyond your prejudices or if you are too small to carry the weight of real responsibility." Silas looked at his ranch house, his cattle, his comfortable life, built through decades of backbreaking work and careful investment. Then he looked at the warriors surrounding him, at the two powerful chiefs who could destroy everything he had built, with a single word at the ring of ceremonial fires that marked his complete helplessness in this situation. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he also remembered the tall woman's dignified response to his cruelty, the way she had absorbed his public humiliation, without flinching, the mysterious respect she had commanded from everyone who saw her. Despite, or perhaps because of the grace with which she handled his thoughtless attack on her dignity. "What kind of work?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Chief Ironhawk smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression, only the cold satisfaction of a hunter who had successfully cornered his prey. "You will tend the horses, all of them from both tribes. You will carry water from the stream to the camp, every barrel needed for cooking, cleaning, drinking, and washing. You will gather wood for fires, prepare food when asked, clean whatever needs cleaning, repair whatever needs repairing. You will do this from sunrise to sunset for 30 days under the constant observation of both tribes, with your every action judged and evaluated." Silas felt his pride recoil at the description, like a snake striking at flame. These were tasks for servants, for children learning responsibility, for people at the very bottom of society's hierarchy. They were the kinds of jobs he had spent his entire adult life rising above the humble labor he had escaped through determination and success. "That's not work for a man of my position," he protested, his voice carrying a hint of the old arrogance despite his desperate circumstances. Ayana did not think judging people by their physical appearance was work for a woman of her position. Ironhawk replied with devastating smoothness. Yet, you forced that role upon her, made her subject to your evaluation and dismissal, based on nothing more substantial than her height. Now you will discover what it feels like to be judged as too small for the work given to you. The assembled warriors watched in absolute silence. As Silas wrestled with his decision, their faces revealing nothing of their thoughts, but their eyes, missing nothing of his internal struggle. He was trapped between his pride and his survival, with no good options remaining, and time running out as surely as water flowing through sand. "Moat my ranch," he said, desperately grasping for any argument that might change the terms of this impossible choice. "My cattle need daily care. Without proper attention, they'll scatter or die, and I'll lose everything I've worked for. Your neighbor Jeremiah has agreed to oversee your animals and property." The elderly man interjected gently. "He feels responsible for allowing your insult to go unchallenged in his establishment. He believes that his silence made him complicit in your cruelty." Even Jeremiah had been drawn into this web of consequences, volunteering to help repair the damage Silas had caused. The entire territory would know what he had done and what price he was paying for his thoughtless moment of superiority. "Do you accept?" Ironhawk asked, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Silas looked around at the hundreds of warriors, then back at the two chiefs who held his fate in their hands like fragile glass that could be crushed with the slightest pressure. He thought of his comfortable life, his reputation as a successful rancher, the respect he had commanded among the local settlers. All of it was meaningless, now reduced to dust by a moment of thoughtless cruelty that had revealed the ugly truth lurking beneath his carefully constructed image. "I accept," he said quietly, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. Within minutes, the warriors had organized themselves with military efficiency that spoke of long practice in breaking camp and moving large numbers of people and animals. They gathered Silas's essential belongings, saddled his horse, and began the journey to a flat area in the valley below his ranch where both tribes could establish a temporary camp to observe his labor and judge his progress. As they rode through the desert landscape that had been his kingdom just hours earlier, Silas found himself beside the elderly man, who had first approached him with the flag of truce. "What is your name?" Silas asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "I am Joseph Crowfeather. I serve as translator when Chief Running Bear wishes to communicate with your people, and as advisor when wisdom is needed more than weapons." Will I see her, Ayana?" Joseph studied him carefully, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Why do you ask this question?" "I want to apologize properly. I want her to know that I understand how wrong I was." Apologies are words that cost nothing to speak and less to hear. Joseph replied with gentle firmness. "Your 30 days will be actions that cost everything to complete. We shall see which speaks more truthfully about your character, your words of regret, or your willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of making amends." They reached the designated campsite as the sun approached its zenith, transforming the desert air into shimmering waves of heat that made the distant mountains dance like mirages. Immediately, without ceremony or explanation, Silas was handed a pair of water buckets that seemed designed more to test endurance than to accomplish efficient work. The buckets were larger and heavier than any he had ever used, crafted from thick wood, and bound with iron hoops that added unnecessary weight. The rope handles were rough, obviously designed to bite into soft hands and leave lasting marks as reminders of the work being performed. "The stream is there," one of the younger warriors said, in heavily accented English, pointing toward a line of cottonwood trees that marked a watercourse perhaps a quarter-mile away across uneven rocky ground. "The camp will need water for cooking, for cleaning, for the horses for drinking. Much water. Begin now." As Silas began his first trip to the stream, the buckets already feeling impossibly heavy despite being empty. He could feel hundreds of eyes following his every movement, like physical weight pressing against his shoulders. Warriors from both tribes had positioned themselves strategically to observe his labor from every angle, some seated on elevated rocks that provided clear sight lines, others standing in small groups that could move to maintain visual contact as he worked. Some looked curious about this unusual form of justice, clearly wondering whether a proud white rancher could endure even a single day of the honest labor their own people performed without complaint. Others seemed openly skeptical, their expressions suggesting they expected him to quit before noon or demand special treatment based on his status in the outside world. A few appeared quietly amused at the sight of someone they had probably heard described as powerful and successful, now reduced to the most basic manual labor. But it was the eyes he didn't see that troubled him most as he stumbled across the uneven ground toward the distant stream. Where was Ayana? Was she watching from some hidden vantage point, evaluating his efforts and finding them wanting? Or had she dismissed him from her thoughts entirely, considering him too insignificant to merit her attention now that justice was being served? The first day nearly destroyed him in ways he had never imagined possible. By noon, with the sun beating down mercilessly from a cloudless sky, Silas's back ached from carrying water buckets that seemed to grow heavier with each trip, despite his attempts to find more efficient carrying techniques. The rough rope handles had already rubbed his palms raw, leaving angry red welts that stung with salt sweat and promised to become serious wounds if the work continued much longer. His legs trembled from the constant walking between the stream and the camp, across terrain deliberately chosen to be as challenging as possible, requiring him to navigate rocks, thorny bushes, and uneven ground that tested his balance with every step. His shoulders burned from the unaccustomed strain of carrying heavy loads in a manner completely different from any work he had done during 30 years of ranching. But the water carrying was only the beginning of his education in humility. After completing what felt like dozens of trips to fill the camp's various containers, cooking pots, cleaning basins, drinking vessels' troughs for the horses, Silas was assigned to gather firewood from the surrounding desert. This meant locating suitable branches and fallen logs, many of which required cutting or breaking to proper size, using unfamiliar tools, then carrying them back to camp in loads that left his arms scratched and bleeding from thorns and rough bark. The Apache warriors observed his clumsy efforts with the critical eyes of professionals evaluating an amateur's work. Some offered quiet corrections when he performed tasks incorrectly, pointing out more efficient routes between work areas, demonstrating proper techniques for cutting wood without wasting energy, showing him how to stack loads for easier carrying. Others simply watched in silence as if he were an exotic animal they were studying for signs of intelligence or adaptation. Next came horse care, a task that should have been familiar to someone who had owned livestock for decades, but proved surprisingly difficult when applied to animals he didn't know and who didn't trust him. The horses seemed to sense his inexperience and lack of confidence, making the work more challenging by shying away from his fumbling hands, refusing to stand still for his ministrations, or simply ignoring his commands in favor of their regular handlers. Checking hooves for stones or injuries required getting close to powerful animals who could kill him with a single kick if they chose to. Brushing coats meant understanding each horse's temperament and preferences, knowledge that could only be gained through patient observation and gentle interaction. Ensuring adequate water and feed involved learning the specific needs of different animals, from pregnant mares, who required extra nutrition, to older horses, whose digestion demanded special attention. Through it all, the watching warriors provided a constant reminder that his every action was being evaluated and judged. Some offered guidance when his ignorance threatened to harm the animals or waste precious resources. Others maintained stoic silence that somehow felt more critical than open mockery would have been. The worst part of this first day wasn't the physical exhaustion that left his muscles screaming in protest, or even the constant scrutiny that made him feel like a performer in some cruel entertainment. It was the gradual realization that every task, every difficulty, every moment of strain and frustration was carefully designed to mirror what he had done to Ayanna in the general store. The casual dismissal based on appearance rather than capability. The public humiliation delivered in front of witnesses. The assumption that physical characteristics determined worth and suitability for important work. The complete lack of interest in understanding the individual beneath the surface differences. As evening approached and long shadows began stretching across the camp, Silas was given his final assignment of the day, preparing the fire pit for the evening meal. His muscles screamed in protest as he arranged stones in the proper pattern, gathered kindling and larger wood in the correct proportions, and attempted to create a fire that would burn steadily without wasting precious fuel. His movements were clumsy and inefficient, those of someone unaccustomed to this type of detailed work. His hands shook from exhaustion, making it difficult to handle small pieces of kindling with the precision required. His knowledge of fire building, adequate for the simple needs of ranch life, proved woefully inadequate for the more complex requirements of cooking for a large group in an efficient, controlled manner. That's when she appeared, materializing from the gathering darkness with the same silent grace she had shown in the general store. Ayanna walked into the camp as quietly as she had left Jeremiah's establishment the day before. But now she wore traditional Apache dress that transformed her from an unusually tall woman seeking work into someone who belonged completely in this environment. Her clothing was made from soft leather, decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the firelight and threw it back in patterns that seemed to tell stories of their own. Her hair was braided with feathers and small ornaments that marked her elevated status within the tribe, and her entire bearing spoke of someone completely comfortable with her own authority and importance. She looked like what she truly was, the daughter of a chief, a woman of significance and dignity, who commanded respect through her own merit rather than demanding it through inherited privilege or assumed superiority. She glanced at Silas briefly as he struggled with the fire preparation, her expression as composed and unreadable as ever, then spoke quietly to Joseph Crow Feather in rapid Apache. Their conversation was brief but intense, and Silas caught the sound of his name mixed with words he couldn't understand, but whose tone suggested evaluation and judgment. Joseph approached him as Ayanna moved toward the area where the tribal leaders were gathering for their evening meal and conference. "Ayanna wishes to know how you find the work," Joseph said in his careful English. This was his chance, his opportunity to apologize directly, to explain himself, to begin the process of making genuine amends for his thoughtless cruelty. All day he had been rehearsing what he would say when this moment came, preparing words that might begin to bridge the gap his arrogance had created. "Tell her I'm sorry," Silas said urgently, his voice carrying more desperation than dignity. "Tell her I was wrong and stupid and cruel, and that I realize now how badly I treated her. Tell her I understand why she walked away from me, and that I'm grateful for this chance to make things right." Joseph held up a weathered hand, his expression patient but firm. "She did not ask for apologies or explanations. She asked how you find the work." Silas looked across the camp to where Ayanna sat with the tribal elders, her tall frame elegant even in repose. She wasn't looking in his direction, but he sensed she was listening carefully to Joseph's translation of their conversation, evaluating his responses with the same careful attention she had given to selecting supplies in the general store. "It's harder than I expected," he said honestly, abandoning his prepared speech in favor of simple truth. "Much harder. My body hurts in ways I didn't know were possible, and my pride hurts worse than any physical pain." Joseph relayed his words in Apache. Ayanna listened without visible reaction, then responded in her own language. "She says this is good," Joseph translated. "Pain means you are learning something your body and spirit have never encountered before. Growth is always uncomfortable." "Learning what?" Another brief exchange in Apache, the melodious sounds carrying meanings he wished desperately he could understand. "She says you are learning what it feels like to be judged as inadequate for the work you are given, to have your capabilities dismissed based on appearance rather than demonstrated ability. Yesterday, you decided she was too tall for your tasks. Today, you discover whether you are strong enough for hers. The parallel hit Silas like a physical blow, driving home the deliberate nature of this justice with crystal clarity. Every task he had been given, every challenge he had faced, every moment of exhaustion and frustration was designed to give him the exact experience he had so casually inflicted on her. The feeling of being dismissed, judged inadequate, found wanting, before even being given a chance to prove his worth. Ayanna spoke once more to Joseph, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard and heeded, then rose and walked toward the area where the women were preparing sleeping areas for the night. "Wait!" Silas called out, his voice carrying further than he had intended across the quiet camp. "What did she say?" Joseph looked at him for a long moment before answering, his weathered face revealing something that might have been sympathy. "She said that tomorrow the work will be harder. She wants to discover whether you will quit when tasks become truly difficult, or whether you possess the strength to continue, even when everything in your body and spirit demands that you stop and run back to your comfortable life." As Ayanna disappeared into the gathering darkness beyond the firelight, her tall figure merging with the shadows, like a spirit returning to the desert that had shaped her, Silas understood that this ordeal was about far more than 30 days of manual labor, or even making amends for a single moment of cruelty. This was about discovering what kind of man he truly was beneath the layers of pride, prejudice, and assumed superiority that had defined his adult life. This was about learning whether he had the courage to grow beyond his limitations, or whether he would prove too small to carry the weight of real responsibility and genuine change. The second week brought new challenges that attacked his assumptions about dignity, worth, and what constituted appropriate work for someone of his social standing. Silas was assigned to help the women with food preparation tasks he had always considered not just beneath his dignity as a successful rancher, but fundamentally inappropriate for any man who respected himself and expected respect from others. His large, calloused hands, so skilled at rope work and cattle handling, proved embarrassingly clumsy and awkward when required to perform the delicate operations that kept the camp fed and functional. Grinding corn into meal required a patience and rhythm he had never developed, a willingness to repeat the same motion thousands of times until the grain reached the proper consistency. His attempts produced uneven results. Some kernels ground too fine and others barely cracked, creating a mixture unsuitable for the flatbread that formed a staple of the camp diet. Weaving baskets from desert grasses demanded an understanding of tension pattern and material properties that challenged his assumptions about what constituted skilled work. Each reed had to be selected for its specific qualities, prepared through careful soaking and splitting, and then woven according to traditional patterns that served both functional and aesthetic purposes. His fumbling attempts created loose, uneven containers that would be useless for carrying grain, water, or the countless other materials that required secure transport. Mending torn clothing with precise stitches involved working with materials and tools completely different from anything in his ranching experience. Leather required different techniques than cloth, different needles, different thread, different approaches to creating seams that would hold under stress. His attempts to repair a torn shirt resulted in stitches so large and uneven that the garment looked worse than before he had touched it. The Apache women were patient teachers, but their standards were absolutely unforgiving. When Silas ruined a basket by weaving the reeds too tightly, creating gaps that would make it useless for carrying grain or water, he was required to start over completely from the beginning, wasting hours of work and precious materials. When he allowed the evening stew to burn by letting the fire grow too hot while his attention wandered to the watching warriors, he went hungry while preparing a replacement meal for the entire camp, working by firelight to feed people whose disapproval he could feel like heat from the flames. These weren't arbitrary punishments designed to humiliate him. They were the natural consequences of inattention and inexperience, the same consequences any Apache child would face while learning these essential skills. But for Silas, accustomed to commanding, rather than serving, to delegating difficult tasks, rather than mastering them personally. Each failure felt like a personal humiliation that stripped away another layer of his carefully constructed identity. Through it all, Ayanna maintained her distant observation with the patience of someone watching a natural process unfold. She would appear at different times throughout the day, sometimes early morning when the camp was just stirring to life, sometimes during the heat of midday when work became most difficult, sometimes in the evening when exhaustion made every task feel impossible. She might speak quietly with the tribal elders, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinions were valued and whose insights were sought. She might watch his struggles with an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts, neither approval nor disapproval, just careful assessment of his progress and attitude. But she never addressed him directly, never offered encouragement or criticism, never acknowledged his presence except as one more element of the camp that required her attention as daughter of the chief. Her continued distance troubled him more with each passing day, creating an ache that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. He found himself working harder when he sensed she was watching, trying to demonstrate improvement and genuine effort. But her reaction never changed. She observed, evaluated, and moved on to other concerns without giving him any indication of whether his efforts were meeting her expectations or falling short of minimal standards. On the 15th day, as Silas struggled to repair a torn bridle with fingers that felt thick and clumsy compared to the delicate work required, a small voice spoke beside him with the directness that only children possess. "You are the man who was rude to Ayanna." Silas looked up from his fumbling attempts at leatherwork to find a boy of perhaps 8 years old, watching his efforts with serious dark eyes that seemed far too mature for his young face. The child had the confident bearing of someone raised among warriors, but his expression held curiosity rather than the judgment or hostility Silas might have expected. "Yes," Silas replied, not looking up from his work. "I am that man. My father says you are learning to be smaller than you thought you were." The observation was delivered without malice, just the matter-of-fact assessment of a child who had been listening to adult conversations and was trying to understand the strange situation unfolding in his world. "I suppose that's one way to describe what's happening to me," Silas admitted. The boy observed Silas's fumbling attempts at leatherwork for several minutes, his young face serious as he evaluated the technique and results. Then, without being asked or invited, he knelt beside the struggling adult and began demonstrating the proper method with the patient instruction of someone much older. "Like this?" The child set his small fingers moving with practiced skill that made Silas's efforts look pathetic by comparison. "The leather wants to bend and flow, not fight against your hands. You must work with its nature, not against it, or it will never do what you need." As they worked together, adult and child united in the common goal of creating something useful and functional, Silas realized something remarkable was happening. This boy, who had every reason to see him as an enemy, someone who had insulted a respected and beloved member of his tribe, was treating him with simple human kindness that asked for nothing in return. No judgment about his past behavior, no demands for apologies or explanations, no attempts to make him feel worse about his situation. Just a willingness to help another person who was struggling with an unfamiliar task, the same generous spirit he might show to any adult who needed assistance with work they didn't understand. "What is your name?" Silas asked as they worked side by side. "Little Eagle. Ayanna is my cousin." Silas's hands stilled on the leather, and he felt his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. This child was family to the woman he had wronged, raised by people who had every reason to teach him hatred and contempt for the man who had treated their daughter so cruelly. Does she ever speak of me?" he asked quietly. Little Eagle considered this question with the seriousness that children sometimes bring to adult concerns, understanding instinctively that his answer carried weight beyond casual conversation. "She says you are like a wild horse that has never learned to carry a rider," the boy replied thoughtfully. Very proud, very strong, but not yet useful to anyone, including yourself. She wonders if you can learn to bear weight without bucking everyone off your back. The comparison was both insightful and painful, capturing something essential about his character that Silas was only beginning to recognize himself. "And what do you think?" he asked. "Do you think I can learn?" The boy studied Silas's work with the critical eye of someone much older than his years, evaluating not just the technical skill, but the attitude and effort behind it. "I think you are trying harder than you did when you first came here," Little Eagle said finally. "That is more than many grown men would do when faced with work they think is beneath them." Over the following days, other members of the camp began to interact with Silas, more naturally responding to his genuine efforts and gradually improving attitude, not as an enemy being punished for past wrongs, but as someone authentically attempting to learn their ways and contribute to the community's welfare according to his growing abilities. They corrected his mistakes without mockery, understanding that ignorance could be cured through patient instruction. They shared techniques that made his work more efficient and less wasteful, recognizing that everyone benefited when tasks were performed properly. They gradually included him in the conversations that flowed around the evening fires, treating him as a member of the temporary community rather than an outsider serving a sentence. But Ayana's continued distance troubled him more, with each passing day creating an emotional ache that proved more difficult to bear than any physical discomfort. He found himself working harder when he sensed she was watching, trying to demonstrate improvement and genuine commitment to the process of change she had set in motion. But her reaction never varied. She observed with the same calm attention she brought to everything, evaluated what she saw with criteria he couldn't understand, and moved on to other concerns without giving him any indication of whether his efforts met her expectations. On the 20th day, as the sun set behind the western mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that should have been beautiful, but somehow felt melancholy, Silas finally gathered the courage to approach Joseph Crowfeather directly. "Why won't she speak to me?" he asked as the elderly man worked on fletching arrows with the meticulous precision of someone for whom such tasks had become second nature through decades of practice. Joseph looked up from his work, considering the question with the careful attention he brought to all matters involving human relationships and their complexities. "Would you speak to someone who had insulted you publicly if you believed they were simply trying to avoid the consequences of their actions rather than experiencing genuine remorse? I hope I would show that kind of forgiveness, yes." "Ah, but that assumes the person seeking forgiveness was genuinely sorry rather than merely afraid of punishment. Which are you, Silas Ward? Sorry for your actions, or simply afraid of what might happen if you don't convincingly pretend to be sorry?" The question hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own motivations and the authenticity of his transformation. Was his remorse genuine, or was he simply an accomplished performer going through the motions to escape consequences he couldn't bear? That night, as Silas lay on his simple bedroll, looking up at the vast canopy of desert stars that seemed to stretch into infinity, he forced himself to examine his heart with ruthless honesty. His initial motivation had indeed been fear. Fear of violence. Fear of losing everything he had built. Fear of being destroyed by forces he had carelessly provoked through his arrogance. But somewhere during these weeks of honest labor, of learning to see the world from perspectives he had never considered, something fundamental had shifted in his understanding. He had begun to see Ayana not as the too tall Apache woman who had dared to request work from someone of his importance, but as a complex individual with her own dignity, intelligence, and intrinsic worth that had nothing to do with his approval or disapproval. He had started to recognize the casual cruelty of his dismissal, the way it had reduced a complete human being to a single physical characteristic he had decided made her unsuitable for his consideration. More importantly, he had begun to understand how his attitude reflected a broader pattern of thinking that allowed him to dismiss entire groups of people based on superficial differences rather than taking the time and effort required to see them as individuals worthy of respect and understanding. The realization was both liberating and terrifying, like discovering that the foundation of a house you had lived in for decades was built on sand rather than solid rock. On the 30th and final day of his sentence, Silas woke before dawn and completed his assigned tasks with hands that had grown strong and skilled through weeks of unfamiliar labor. The water buckets that had once felt impossibly heavy now seemed manageable, his body having adapted to their weight, and his technique having improved through constant practice. His fingers moved with developing confidence through leather working and basket weaving, creating results that, while not yet matching the standards of lifelong practitioners, were at least functional and showed clear improvement. His back had adapted to the constant bending and lifting required by his duties, muscles strengthening and posture adjusting to handle physical demands completely different from anything in his previous experience. His hands had developed new calluses in different places, marking the adaptation to tools and techniques he had never imagined he would need to master. More importantly, his perspective had undergone a transformation that went far deeper than physical adaptation to manual labor. He had learned to find dignity in honest work, regardless of its social status or the opinions of others. He had discovered that strength wasn't about making others feel small or asserting dominance over those different from himself, but about contributing to something larger than his individual concerns and helping others succeed according to their own definitions of success. As the sun reached its zenith, marking the completion of his sentence with the precision of a natural clock, both chiefs called for a formal assembly that would determine his fate and the future of relationships between their peoples and the white settlers of the territory. Warriors from both tribes gathered in a large circle, their faces serious as they prepared to witness a ceremony that would set precedents for how similar conflicts might be resolved in the future. Silas stood in the center of this ring of judgment, looking different now, leaner from hard work and simple food. Weathered by constant exposure to desert sun and wind, humbled by weeks of honest labor that had stripped away the layers of arrogance and assumed superiority that had once defined his public identity. Chief Running Bear spoke first in Apache, his words carrying the weight and formality of tribal law and ancient traditions of justice. Joseph Crow Feather translated for Silas and any others who needed to understand the proceedings that would determine whether this experiment in alternative justice had succeeded or failed. He says you have completed the 30 days without complaint, rebellion, or attempts to escape your obligations. Your work has been acceptable to those who supervised your efforts. Your attitude has improved steadily throughout this period. Your effort appears to have been genuine rather than merely performed for show to deceive observers. Chief Ironhawk stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone present as he prepared to render the final judgment that would determine Silas's fate. The question now, he said in his precise, educated English, is whether you understand what you have learned during this time, or whether you have simply endured 30 days of discomfort while waiting to return to your old ways and old thinking. Silas looked around the circle of faces that had become familiar over the past month, warriors who had watched his transformation with varying degrees of skepticism and approval, women who had taught him patience and precision in work. He had never valued children who had shown him kindness, despite having every reason to maintain the resentments of their elders. Finally, his eyes found Ayanna. She stood beside her father, tall and dignified as always, watching him with the same composed expression she had maintained throughout his trial. But now Silas could see past the surface calm to recognize the intelligent strength and quiet authority that had commanded respect from everyone who met her. He understood now why people had stepped aside for her in the general store, why they had treated her with reverence that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with genuine recognition of worth. I learned that I was completely wrong, Silas said, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. Not just about height or physical appearance, not just about who deserves work or respect, but about the fundamental way I looked at people who were different from me in any way. He paused, gathering courage for the deeper admission that he knew was necessary for any real resolution. I learned that honest work has dignity regardless of who performs it, regardless of how others might judge it, regardless of what I had been taught about social status and hierarchy. I learned that real strength isn't about making others feel small or asserting dominance over those who seem different. It's about lifting people up and helping them succeed according to their own goals and dreams. Another pause as he struggled to find words for the most important realization of all. But most of all, I learned that Ayanna was absolutely right to walk away from me that day. I wasn't worthy of her consideration then, and I'm grateful she had the wisdom and self-respect to recognize that before wasting any more of her valuable time on someone too ignorant and arrogant to see her worth. For the first time since his trial began, Ayanna stepped forward and spoke directly to him, her voice clear and strong as it carried across the assembled crowd. You spoke of my height as if it were a defect that needed correction. She said each word chosen with obvious care, as if the Creator had made some error that required your judgment and disapproval. But my height allows me to see farther across the plains, to spot approaching danger or identify opportunities for our people. It enables me to reach higher branches for fruit that feeds hungry children when other food is scarce. It allows me to stand as an equal among the tallest warriors of both tribes when important decisions must be made that affect our future. She moved closer until she stood directly in front of him, her impressive stature no longer seeming unusual or inappropriate, but simply part of who she was meant to be. My height is not too much. It is exactly what I am meant to be, just as your pride made you smaller than you were meant to be. The question now is whether you will remember these lessons when you return to your comfortable life and familiar surroundings, or whether you will gradually forget them as the memory of discomfort fades and old habits reassert themselves. Silas met her gaze steadily, no longer intimidated by her height or her dignified bearing. Seeing her now as the remarkable individual she had always been, rather than the collection of superficial characteristics his prejudice had allowed him to perceive. I hope I'll remember everything I've learned here, he said quietly. I hope I'm worthy of the patience and wisdom you've shown me, even though I certainly didn't deserve such generous treatment. Chief Running Bear spoke again, and Joseph translated the formal conclusion. He says the debt has been paid in full. You are free to return to your ranch and your former life with no further obligations to our peoples. The circle began to disperse as warriors returned to their horses and prepared for the journey back to their permanent territories. But Ayanna remained, and her next words surprised everyone present, including the tribal leaders who had orchestrated this unusual form of justice. There is something else that should be discussed, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone whose opinions were valued and whose suggestions were taken seriously. Both our tribes have decided to establish a permanent trading post in this valley. We need someone who understands both Apache ways and the customs of white settlers. Someone who has proven they can learn from their mistakes and grow beyond their initial prejudices and limitations. She extended her hand, not in supplication as she had in the general store a month earlier, but as an equal offering partnership to another equal who had earned the right to such consideration through demonstrated change and growth. The work pays well, she said with the faintest hint of a smile that transformed her entire face. And there are absolutely no height requirements for employment. Silas looked at her outstretched hand and then up into her dignified face that now seemed beautiful, rather than merely unusual. 30 days ago, he would have seen only differences, and the bronze skin that marked her heritage said the extraordinary height that set her apart from others, the foreign customs and unfamiliar ways that made her seem like an outsider in his world. Now he saw wisdom earned through experience, strength tempered by compassion, integrity that had remained unshaken by his cruelty. and a generosity of spirit that offered him a chance to continue learning and growing, rather than simply returning to his old life unchanged. He took her hand in both of his, feeling the calluses that spoke of her own familiarity with honest work, and shook it with the respect due to someone who had proven herself worthy of admiration through actions rather than demanding it through inheritance or assumption. "I would be deeply honored to work with you," he said, meaning every word with a sincerity that surprised him with its intensity. For the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, Ayanna smiled not with triumph or satisfaction at seeing him humbled, not with the cold pleasure of successful revenge, but with genuine warmth and the real possibility of friendship built on mutual respect and understanding. As the two tribal groups prepared to depart, leaving Silas to contemplate his transformed circumstances and his fundamentally changed understanding of himself and the world around him, he realized that he had gained far more than he had lost. His pride and prejudices had been stripped away through weeks of challenging work and constant evaluation. But in their place had grown wisdom, humility, and the beginning of true strength, the kind that lifted others up rather than pushing them down to make himself feel superior. The trading post would be built according to plans that respected both cultures and served the needs of all peoples in the territory. The alliance between the tribes would be strengthened by commerce and mutual benefit, rather than maintained through fear or temporary convenience. And Silas Ward, former proud rancher, who had once judged a remarkable woman by nothing more than her height, would spend his remaining years learning that true dignity came not from what made him different from others, but from what made him willing to see and celebrate their common humanity. In the distance, the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless this new beginning with the promise of justice served wisdom earned, and the possibility of genuine friendship between people who had learned to see past surface differences to the deeper truths that connected all human hearts.